name is Ramana. I am a professor in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia, and I'm the director of its Liu Institute for Global Issues. I'm also on the executive committee of the Center for India and South Asia Research, which is part of the Institute for Asian Research, which is part of the SPPGA. I'm also a member of the Green College Common Room. Thus, I'm associated with all the organizations that came together to put this event up tonight. However, I have to start out with a special shout out to the two Green College staff members who've done all of the work to make this possible, Tanya Storino and Alan Gumbok. Thank you all for the facilitation. I would like to begin by acknowledging that most of us are gathered on indigenous territories. I'm joining from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam peoples. The Musqueam have carried this area home for thousands of years. It's my privilege to be living and working here. It's also my pleasure to be welcoming all of you today to today's encounter with Aasim Sajjad Akhtar and Sadia Tasleem. Aasim is Associate Professor of Political Economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at Quaid-i-Azam University in Islamabad. He works on diverse subjects such as state theory, informality, colonial history, and social movements. He's also the author of 3 books, most recently, The Politics of Common Sense, State, Society, and Culture in Pakistan. He also writes a syndicated column for Pakistan's most important newspaper, Dawn. And alongside all his academic pursuits and writing, Aasim has also been closely affiliated with the political and social movements in Pakistan for more than 2 decades now. The other person who's joining us today is Sadia Tasleem, who formerly of Green College also. Sadia is currently a PhD student at UBC and a lecturer at Quaid-i-Azam's University's Department of Defense and Strategic Studies in Islamabad, Pakistan. She has done extensive research on various aspects of strategic stability, nuclear learning, and the implications of knowledge diffusion, and is a core member of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I have to specifically thank Sadia because even though I was the one who invited Aasim, I realized quickly that I know very little about some of the things that Aasim will be talking about. And so I roped in Sadia to enlighten us with her much deeper knowledge of Pakistan. So I'm grateful that she accepted to do that. The topic of today's encounter is the historical context of China's Belt and Road Initiative in the context of Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is the flagship project of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and it is expected to usher in more than $60 billion of investment in Pakistan. It has brought in much praise. The cliche game changer has been used quite often, as well as a number of concerns. A recent story in the UK newspaper, The Guardian, earlier this month is a good example. The title of the article is Lahore's Metro Line Open to Fanfare, but what is the real cost of China's gift? And the blurb underneath reads, the Pakistani city's railway is a hit with passengers, but critics say worker debts and huge debt are too high a price to pay. Aasim has written much about this particular topic. Indeed, an article he wrote for Monthly Review was among the readings I've used in my class in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs on security challenges for Asian states and peoples. So it's wonderful to be talking to him directly. I'd also like to make 2 announcements before we begin. First, the meeting is being recorded. In case you have a problem with yourself being recorded, please keep your silence. Second, please put in any questions you have through the chat function. This allows us to more optimally allot time to the speakers themselves to speak. So to start off, I will request Aasim and Sadia to deliver some initial remarks, after which we will go into a more conversational mode before turning to questions from the audience. Thank you for joining us, Sadia and Aasim, and over to you.
Should I go first, Sadia? Okay. Thank you to all of the organizers, to Dr. Ramana in particular, to the obviously participants who've joined us today. This is how things get done in this day and age, so we're all very familiar with it now. but obviously it does mean that people take out time. So I appreciate all of you being here and the hard work that's gone on behind the scenes. As was just pointed out in the introduction, CPEC is a sort of has been over the last some years now big news in Pakistan. I mean, it's a bit of a sine curve. Sometimes it falls out of the news a little bit as well, and I'll try and get to that as in this little brief that I'll offer you. But I think probably most useful would be to place CPEC and sort of the interventions that it entails within a broader sort of history of Pakistan's relationship with China and more generally. So I mean, I think the reason why CPEC is of such interest, not only of course to the major protagonists, but also to other observers and to other sort of regional powers as well, is precisely because it shifts sort of in some sense the established strategic balance in and around Pakistan and its wider region. Historically, Pakistan's primary external patron is, as most of you will know, is the United States. You know, we can trace that all the way back to the Cold War and sort of anti-communist pacts. And of course, China being alongside the Soviet Union at the time, the other big communist power with interests in the region. You know, in the first instance, let's say from 1954 or so, when Pakistan sort of comes into direct mutual assistance program, is what it was called, with the United States, arrangements for military aid, training, et cetera, China was very much viewed as one of the threats, as one of the countries that perhaps Pakistan was going to be a bulwark against. But in this very complex sort of Cold War dynamics, it's also through Pakistan that the Chinese-American détente starts, most famously in 71, 72, when the Pakistani government at the time sort of facilitates this secret meeting between Kissinger and Chu Enlai via a Pakistani plane that was supposed to go to a hill station and ended up going up to Beijing. Kissinger was sort of smuggled into China to meet up with Chu Enlai. So there's this sort of strange, rather complex relationship via Pakistan, where Pakistan is this essentially pro-American bulwark. It's a garrison. It is given aid. It is especially through the 1980s described as sort of the front line of the empire of the war against communism, against the Soviet Union. And China is there and thereabouts. Every once in a while, China becomes a bigger player because Washington doesn't deliver to Pakistan what Pakistan really wants, which, just to add some further complexities, is less anti-communism and more support vis-a-vis India. So in this very complex matrix, there's the US, there's Pakistan's own strategic interests vis-a-vis India in particular, and then there's China, which shares the northernmost border of Pakistan, which is also there, but is emerging slowly through the Cold War years to a position of global prominence. And CPEC has to be placed within that sort of post 9/11. America comes in and patronizes Pakistan again for reasons that we all know, vis-a-vis Afghanistan and its war in Afghanistan. But throughout this period, there's this sort of rather love-hate relationship that plays out, where sort of the Americans are one and the same time giving Pakistan aid and asking Pakistan to prosecute the war on terror, but at the same time also calling or being suspicious about Pakistan's actual intentions and the extent to which it is, doing the job asked of it, or in fact, if it's continuing to patronize some of these militants. in this whole story, China, at least in Pakistani circles, is viewed as more of a consistent friend. And this is particularly true after 2002, when Pakistan and China signed a free trade arrangement, which is the first of its kind, which allows Chinese manufacturers in particular to come in and supply the Pakistani market. This then takes us to some of the stats that were just offered to you at the beginning. This radically alters Pakistan's domestic economic matrix, right? So with time, domestic manufacturing is not even in this free trade arrangement. The idea is not for domestic manufacturing to compete or to be given a fillip. In fact, it essentially many small consumer industries or consumer sort of manufacturers are wiped out by the Chinese influx. But this is all considered great because China wants to invest and China wants to give us money, and then this is finally sealed in 2013 when CPEC is announced, which is a massive developmental intervention, largely conceived of as a road infrastructure network all the way from top to bottom, from the northern border down to Pakistan's southern coastline, but also some very big, prominent mega projects like the Gwadar Port on the southwestern tip of Pakistan, which is long projected to be the new Dubai, a deep water, deep sea port. And you'll recall once upon a time that when in the 1980s, the whole sort of in some ways pitch around the anti-Soviet jihad in Afghanistan was, well, the Soviets want to get to warm water via Afghanistan and Pakistan. So it's quite, sort of an interesting, the circle of history sort of being completed where China is now funding this warm water port on the southern coastline of Pakistan, and in some ways being able to access it via these roads that they're also supporting in the construction of. There's other things too. There's some information and communication technology investments. There's including a fairly significant or substantial surveillance network. There's other sectors, industry, agriculture, but largely it is viewed as, or it is, I think it is essentially can be seen as a gateway for China itself to access warm waters down to the south, to have roads, to have a reliable network. And again, another thing that, anecdotally, putting two and two together, the region of China that borders Pakistan up to its north is, of course, Xinjiang, which is in the news in recent years for reasons that I don't need to share with you here. So there's a lot of bits and pieces here. Now, just to go back to where I started, China's footprint, developmental footprint, so to speak, can be contrasted to the historical relationship that the Americans have maintained with Islamabad, which, as I said, has always been more around sort of military imperatives, very much in the form of military aid, training, and so on and so forth. And the consistency is, again, within Pakistani strategic circles with which China has, at least over the last 20 to 30 years, patronized and supported Pakistan, versus the more on-off sort of borderline arm twisting of the United States, that, we're going to give you aid in the name of fighting terror, but we'll also as quickly turn off the aid tap when you don't do our bidding. So that has generated an impression, or this impression of CPEC being, as Dr. Ramana said, a game changer, as China being, this everlasting friend that never lets us down, which frankly doesn't necessarily stack up with history if we go much further back, especially when direct conflict with India, we put that into the story. But just to give you a sense, and lastly, to do with the actual impacts, to the extent, I mean, the whole thing around CPEC, the whole sort of issue, the process through which CPEC was initiated, designed, implemented, has always been very opaque. There's been very little information in the public realm. The major document around its design was sort of in some ways forced to be released by the government of the time in 2000, and I think it was 16 perhaps, in the previous regime led by Nawaz Sharif and the Muslim League, because there was a leak, essentially because, you know, people got their hands on the document and then the government post facto released it. All of the financial arrangements, you know, the way in which in the public eye it's been contrasted that China is giving us all of these really great concessional terms, but the more and more information came out into the public realm, and it became clear that, frankly, this is going to be a significant debt burden. And for those of you who are familiar with Chinese investments, let's say in Sri Lanka, in parts of Africa, this is not an unfamiliar story. There has been considerable debt that is piled up with regards to Chinese investments. And if you look at, essentially, if we have sort of a broader macro view of why China has moved to these mass infrastructural investments, I think it speaks to larger questions of how its policy of 25 years of having you know, reserves of cheap labor that allow it to flood its manufacturers and world markets. That larger sort of, I think, phase of Chinese development, or China's political economy, is now giving way to you know, the excess capacity that has been generated by this policy now having to be invested, because, you know, that old policy of using its cheap labor to flood world markets perhaps is on the way out, or it's being transitioned away from. So it makes sense that these investments would take place. It made sense that China would want a return on these investments, and it makes sense that it's not just going to give out freebies, and much of this is going to be debt financed, and it's going to be recovered. And so more and more of this information has come out in the public realm. But on the whole, I can't say that there's a great deal of, let's say, resistance, whether it's in the mainstream or otherwise, to any of these. And this speaks to, again, a longer history of Pakistan being essentially a state that has always sort of rented out its strategic location, whether to the highest bidder in a way. And that, you know, I haven't had time here to speak about the biggest player in this story, which in Pakistan is always the military. And that's another part of this story. That applies to the military, that applies to even mainstream political parties as well, that have historically not necessarily challenged that larger model of Pakistan's engagement with the world, because all of this is generally viewed as being the only way to do things, because, you know, we have to compete with a much bigger neighbor, which is India, and the only way to do so is to sort of rely on external forms of support. So there's a new story here, which is China and the way it's doing it, but there's also an old story, a longer term story, and I think the debate is really about whether the changing guard, let's say, whether China's patronage offers much that is different from historic American patronage. And on the one hand, it does, certainly, because of the nature of the aid. But you know, on the other hand, does it reduce Pakistan's dependency, you know, economically? Does it make it more independent on a world stage in terms of articulating foreign policy? Does it change its historic policies vis-a-vis its neighbors, particularly India? And for someone like myself, as if not most important, does it allow, or does this developmental model, does it generate, or does it reduce inequalities within society, within Pakistan's regions, you know, on class terms? What kind of ecological impacts are there? There's a lots that we could get into, but I will stop here, and perhaps we can come back to some of these questions as we move forward.
Thank you, Aasim. That was fascinating. And I'll turn it over to Sadia.
Good evening, everyone at Green College and those joining from other parts of Vancouver. Good morning to all those joining from South Asia. I see a lot of presence from Pakistan and India. First of all, I would like to extend my thanks to Professor Ramana, who is also my supervisor at UBC, for making me a part of this. Also, thanks to SPPGA, CSAR, Alan, Tanya, and everyone at Green College who is involved in conceiving and planning this. It's good to be back at the Coach House, albeit virtually. I must say some of my fondest memories from the last 1 year are of all the great talks that I attended at the college. And I hope tonight's conversation will be a similar experience for the old and the new greenies and for everyone else. Also, I'm glad to see some familiar names here on the screen, so a big shout out to them. Well, it's a challenge to speak right after someone who understands the subject inside out. Unlike Dr. Aasim, I'm not an expert on BRI or on the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I'm just a keen watcher of what's happening in and outside the region, and I'll share my thoughts on the geopolitics and the current status of CPEC. But I'm looking forward to the conversation that will follow. Also, I think Dr. Aasim has given a very comprehensive layout of the larger issue at hand. So I'll just flag 3 points and then maybe some questions for the discussions. So first of all, there is a lot of speculation worldwide on whether China aims to seek global domination through the BRI, or is China's investment in the BRI a way of sustaining China's economic growth? And one can endlessly talk about both sides of the argument. But there is no gainsaying the fact that when it comes to China-Pakistan relations in particular, and the China-Pakistan economic corridor as an extension of the bilateral relationship, it is deeply embedded in the geopolitical realities of the Southern Asian region. In other words, it's not just about economy, as Dr. Aasim has also mentioned. Although China's continued economic growth and Pakistan's financial stability are very important in this regard, nonetheless, both China and Pakistan will continue to cooperate with each other as long as each side finds the other strategically significant, no matter whether they are capable of drawing the economic dividends out of CPEC and other projects or not. And I must say, even though the significance is asymmetrical, with Pakistan at least currently being much more dependent on China for its financial stability, there are shared interests on both sides, and we can talk about that in detail later on. This does not mean that there are no sources of friction between the two sides. There certainly are, and they are expressed occasionally, mostly behind closed doors, but also sometimes through the media. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the geopolitical realities will continue to keep China and Pakistan close to each other in the foreseeable future. Second, albeit the geopolitical nature of the China-Pakistan relations, the success or the challenges to the China-Pakistan economic corridor, the way it's currently planned would largely depend on endogenous as opposed to exogenous factors. And why I say this is because despite the earlier sort of expectations and euphoria about CPEC making Pakistan a regional trade hub, in its current form, CPEC is not a transit corridor. It is at best an economic cooperation framework that can help uplift Pakistan's economy if it's operationalized properly. However, the earlier expectations about CPEC becoming a transit corridor do not appear feasible because of the prohibitive costs that it requires. If China and Pakistan miraculously manage to find a solution to surpass the tough terrain that connects both China and Pakistan, the role of regional actors and their ability to either facilitate or undermine the project will then become critical. But at this point, notwithstanding the high level of concern in Pakistan over India's alleged involvement in sabotaging the CPEC-related projects through what Pakistan calls promotion of subversive activities, the experience and record of the past few years suggest that the delays or abandonment issues related to CPEC have mostly been a consequence of domestic politics in Pakistan, lack of consensus within the provinces and political parties, bureaucratic hurdles, perception gaps between China and Pakistan over who expects what, concerns of the business elite in some parts of the country, the inability of the incumbent government to operationalize some mega projects, and very different work culture in China and Pakistan. Undeniably, concerns relating India have increased the financial cost of some of the projects that involve a huge number of security personnel to protect the infrastructure, but those projects have moved forward nonetheless. The only external actor that can significantly slow down the progress on CPEC is the United States. However, it remains to be seen how the US government under President-elect Joe Biden would deal with Pakistan, China, and the CPEC. There are many unknowns here. During President Obama's term, the US was cautious but supportive of the idea that China should take responsibility to help stabilize regional states, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. At least some in the US back then saw the possibility of the US filling in the gaps or filling in those areas that are less costly but sustainable, for example, creating knowledge corridors and developing soft skills to enable Pakistan to take full advantage of CPEC. But under the Trump administration, just as the hostility against China increased, so did the opposition to the projects that involved China, including direct opposition of the CPEC by the US government. The US expressed deep skepticism over CPEC by flagging issues like lack of transparency, debt trap diplomacy, human rights, sovereignty, etc. Even though some of these questions carry a lot of weight, as they were mentioned also in Dr. Aasim's talk, coming from the US, these looked more rhetorical than genuine, and therefore increased like a lot of skepticism. The major concern that the US flagged was, as Mike Pompeo categorically warned Pakistan against using the IMF financing program to repay Chinese bond holders and banks. Given the fact that the Biden administration will be constrained by power equation in the US Senate and Congress, the likelihood of similar conditionalities cannot be ruled out. Under such circumstances, a lot would depend on how far China wants to go to bail Pakistan out of its balance of payment crisis. By ensuring the success of CPEC, China would like to establish itself as a trustworthy partner for the global South. In this sense, the reputational value of CPEC may incentivize China to accommodate Pakistan's needs. But other factors like China's relations with the US and India, as well as its satisfaction or dissatisfaction over the ongoing and proposed projects under the CPEC will also determine China's decision in this regard and the extent to which China would want to go. My third and last point is that we are witnessing significant changes in the global politics, and it remains to be seen whether China is capable of and willing to create a parallel global order to the one created by the US. But it is hard to dismiss the centrality of China in the regional power equations and emerging alignment patterns, and subsequently its ability to influence not only economy and politics, but also the socio-cultural spaces in the region. Given the fact that Pakistan's political and strategic elite has historically identified itself with the West and with the Western socio-political order, whereas the masses are, if at all, gravitated to a more religiously defined order. Of course, a lot of caveats apply here. The likelihood of social tensions emerging out of a closer interaction with China cannot be ruled out. What would that interaction look like? What would be the future once China and Pakistan develop much closer socio-cultural proximity is something that I would leave at for Dr. Aasim to discuss, given his expertise. That's all I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Both of you have given us really rich sort of topics and overviews of the subject. And ideally, I would just like to say, you know, both of you should just talk to each other and we can just learn from that. But let me sort of abuse my privilege and ask a couple of, you know, stupid questions. So I sort of want to start from one of the things that you mentioned. Both of you kind of talked about it in different ways, about so the Chinese motivations to enter into the One Belt, One Road sort of initiative. And so it's not just in Pakistan, but also in other countries. And in the case of Pakistan, you know, you talked a lot about the Gwadar Port and access to Arabian Sea and so on. Are there sort of similar geostrategic motives everywhere, or is it mostly governed by sort of domestic, the thing that you mentioned about China's sort of changing economic strategy, as it were, because it's no longer able to be exporting at the scale that it was, and it has built up all this productive capacity, so it has to sort of deliver them somewhere. So I just want to sort of, how do you see the trade-off between these two things, and how do they play out in other countries? So just step back from Pakistan for a few minutes.
Yeah, I think that certainly there's no question that, you know, there's obviously context matters, that, you know, wherever China is investing, whether it be the sub-Saharan states in Africa, whether it be other parts of South Asia, East Asia, you know, what the domestic context wants, what that particular country partner wants is certainly part of the story. So the Pakistani context is its own context, whether that the geography or whether there's you know, particular questions of resource endowments, you know, Pakistan's desire for connectivity, notwithstanding what Sadia just said about the extent to which it can be a meaningful transit route or not. And at the same time, I think there are things that we can say that also link all of these diverse contexts, right? So for instance, I mentioned there's a broader Chinese sort of recognition that they can't just keep building massive industrial cities and supplying the world with manufacturers, you know, whether that's because, you know, China wants to now build what it calls an ecological civilization, so it wants to step back from that sort of very high intensity and sort of forms of production, whether its own labor market doesn't facilitate that, whether aggregate demand in the rest of the world, especially now in a COVID world, is declined further, and therefore there's lesser demand. You know, all of these and above. And I think Sadia made a very good point. And I think also this notion of China projecting some kind of new form of power, of being a friend of the South. Now, don't forget, this is an old trope for China, right? With the non-aligned movement and in and around the immediate post-independence world of the 50s, 60s, 70s. So it's not as if this is something that China has not historically pitched itself as, right? As a friend of, you know, whether it be Pakistan or a friend of all of the post-colonial states, right? It's sharing this lineage of wanting to aspire to autonomy and to dignity, away from the Western patrons that most of the world's Asian African countries have historically been, well, saddled with, really. So I think there are some specificities, but there's also some broader logics that transcend the differences of time and space. I'm not certain that. I think there are, yeah, I mean, at the same time, I do think that there's, and the other thing I think also, which is consistent, is what something you mentioned, Ramana, at the beginning about debt and about the kinds of that's not what does China offer. That's more like, what are the potential fallouts that Chinese sort of patronage or Chinese developmental support or these projects in general. And there's evidence, right? We can see it now in different parts of the world. So I think that there's specificities, but there's also there's something that bigger that is going on. And I think that it's absolutely correct to view this, as Sadia said, as two-pronged. This is about specific questions of what China wants to do economically, but it's also about how China wants to project itself as global leader, and you know, whether it does it by virtue of exerting economic power, or whether it does it by virtue of projecting itself as friend. You know, there's that line, as we know, with big powers, is always very fine and blurry.
Sadia, do you want to add something?
I agree with what Dr. Aasim has said. I would just make two very quick points. I think when it comes to Pakistan's context vis-a-vis like all the other places that China is investing, one thing that makes Pakistan's case a bit distinct is the fact that the strategic partnership between Pakistan and China predates the economic relationship that has emerged over the past 20 years. So it's and that clearly sort of indicates that the strategic partnership will continue to grow irrespective of what happens to the larger sort of economic framework. Also, I think one thing that is becoming increasingly obvious over the years is that China, in its experience with Pakistan, particularly under with regard to CPEC, is learning on the job. So what were the initial motives for Pakistan to pitch to the Chinese side, and what were the motivations for China to sort of get so much involved? One thing, and then the Chinese increasing understanding of Pakistan and the dynamics within Pakistan and how that's shifting the goalposts is another. And I think we'll see a lot of adjustments over the next few years with regard to how sort of China interacts with Pakistan with regard to CPEC in particular.
So I want to follow that with another question, this time about the United States. So, you know, you talked about the new and the old story with China, and you also talked about the old story with the United States, you know, starting from the 1950s, Aasim. And Sadia, you sort of talked a little bit about, you know, how the differences between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. But I want to sort of step back a little bit and ask, is there a larger news story about the United States, right? It's a changing place in the world, as it were. Its inability to be able to be as dominant as it could be, and whether sort of US imperialism is changing its stripes, as it were. So is there a bigger story that you can say, which is sort of, you know, abstracted away from these individual personalities and politicians?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there's a bigger story. I mean, and of course, China is the other side of that story, right? Because we are now in a phase globally where the United States ceases to be the world's dominant economic power. And China is gradually taken over that mantle, sure, in terms of financial centers and a global reserve currency. I mean, that's sort of what America is still, you know, hanging on, so to speak, because of that. That's sort of like a historic entrenchment rather than the fact that it is, at least in productive terms, competitive. You know, even in the digital and R&D world, China, and you know, you can see that with Huawei and all of the conflicts and tensions surrounding that. You know, China is catching up, if not overtaking in certain respects. So certainly, I mean, this is a sort of a tale of an empire in decline, right, so to speak. Now, I don't want to overplay that point because I don't buy into it entirely. I don't think that as the world's dominant military power by a long way, that of course has to be tempered. And so in some ways, if we want sort of a global historical comparisons, we have very little to compare with. We've never had an empire that sort of has fallen off its economic perch, or at least has been challenged by at least something contemporary that can challenge it economically, but still exercises such a huge, almost monopoly power militarily, whether it's installations or whether it's just destructive capacity. So, you know, in that sense, there is something new happening. Where does that lead? It's hard to say, right? Because I can't see America, for whatever happens, you know, whatever the Trump years signaled, whatever Trumpism is sort of a form of isolationism may have signaled. And this is an interesting point, right? Because especially in Pakistan, for me, and if I think about it, I mean, you know, Biden coming into power doesn't necessarily signal anything, woohoo, wow, we're going to be really, you know, we're going to get something happen that's going to be great, because it was through the Obama years and prior to that, that of course, the war on terror and all of its fallouts have played out in Pakistan. So I don't see that changing. In fact, I see our region continuing to be a battleground, continuing to be, you know, these sort of rather opaque and war, you know, sort of conflicts playing out, not just between the U.S. in this case and China, but others as well, right? There's so many stories here. There's Iran and there's Saudi Arabia, and of course there's India. So I mean, the American story is still is a larger than life sort of phenomenon, and in some sense, I think that the military part of that story will play out in Pakistan, in this region, in the world at large, precisely because that is how I think Washington will continue to exercise. I can't see Washington going back to the kinds of soft power dominance that it had, you know, that it trumpeted through the 90s, at least through the phase of liberal imperialism. I think that's in the past. I think it's going to be more wait and see, selective engagements, but those engagements, ultimately, the ones that will count will be the ones that, you know, will be strong arm engagements. And that, I think, how that plays out vis-a-vis China's emergent, more other the forms of power that China is exhibiting, I think frankly, I don't see it as it's going to be a great outcome either way for the world's people or for the world's freedom-loving peoples necessarily.
Sajjad, do you want to add anything?
Again, I think I largely agree with what Dr. Aasim has said. Just one quick point. I would say, like, at least at the rhetorical level, there is already some change coming from President-elect Joe Biden. I think it was the day before yesterday or yesterday that he said United States will move towards reclaiming its role as a global leader. I think that that kind of rhetoric will be important, at least at the cosmetic level, if not at the substantive level. And as far as South Asia in particular is concerned, I completely agree with Dr. Aasim suggesting that the US is not going to fundamentally, like, we won't see probably any fundamental shift in the American approach. But in the world at large, particularly in Europe, I think the US will try to go back to multilateralism as opposed to the Trump's era.
There are already questions coming up in the chat, but I'm going to really abuse my privilege and ask one last question, and then we can turn over to that. So the question I want to ask is to sort of move away from the international, as it were, and talk about domestic influences within Pakistan. So, you know, who is supporting these arrangements with China? Who's opposing it? Who's benefiting from it? And, you know, I want to sort of talk about that. I'm not talking about political parties, though you sort of mentioned Nawaz Sharif and Imran Khan and so on, but really social forces. You know, what's happening on the ground there, and yeah, we'll talk more about that.
Well, I mean, of course, and you forgot to mention, well, not you forgot, really, when you think about political parties, there's someone on the apex of Pakistan's political and economic structure, which of course is the military. And I'll get to that. But if you want to think about it more in terms of society at large, look, on the one hand, yes, Sadia sort of hinted at this, not necessarily in this point in particular. I think that there is, within society at large, organized social forces, whether they be, you know, the religious right, whether they be, let's say, traders, whether they be, you know, even the intelligentsia. I think that generally there's much more of a soft corner for China. And that is not just by chance. I think that also is partly the way in which the state, the apparatus itself, the military included, has projected China and been sort of in this on-off love-hate relationship with the United States, right? At least through the 90s, when the Cold War ended, and there was this feeling of like, well, we've been abandoned once the Americans, you know, this feeling of, well, the Americans use us and abuse us, and then they leave us out, and then the Chinese don't do that. And that sort of attitude or that sort of perception, you know, exists within, I'd say organized, I wouldn't say 220 million Pakistanis, I'd say organized social forces, the ones who are able to articulate, you know, clear, you know, sort of shape public opinion. Then there's an element, which I mentioned also earlier, like the trading community. I think they, you know, traders historically in Pakistan have been very influential, and I distinguish traders from, let's say, domestic manufacturers, because they benefit as long as there's more in and out, there's more stuff coming in and out. And so trade has sort of been given a fillip by, especially the free trade arrangement from 2002, because there's, you know, everything from motorcycles to cheap electronics to socks and shoes basically now comes in from China, and actually that is the market. It's interesting because Western imports tend to sort of focus more on higher end parts of the Pakistani market, and the low cost consumer durables that come in from China service, you know, the everyday working class, lower middle class markets. So I think that then reinforces, not just for traders and economic interests that benefit from this expanded economic activity, but also then the everyday consumer, that China then becomes part of our everyday consciousness in a way that America is less and less so, and more and more that perception of, well, China is the real friend and America less so. So I think there is a lot of that going on from top to bottom. It is heavily facilitated by the rhetoric or the kind of the stuff coming down from the state level, but there are organized forces and within society at large. However, I will temper that, just so that we can get into this as well, that the actual impacts, and this is, you know, when I was thinking and writing about CPEC, for me, some of these debates tended to be abstract, right? And it was like, okay, how does this actually play out on the ground? And one of the big aspects of this is, what does China's developmental footprint look like? So where it builds, you know, you mentioned the Orange Line, for example, or Gwadar, or, you know, some of these roads, or especially thermal power plants, which is actually, all told, is the biggest single head that it's investing in, is these big coal-fired, which is really interesting, right? Because it's cutting down coal production at home and sort of externalizing it, sort of like Western imperialist powers have always done, right? Like when the sky, our own sky becomes too black, let's just send that out to the old peripheries, shall we? So all of those impacts have, of course, engendered a different kind of feeling, right? Sort of more resentment, especially in peripheries like the Baloch periphery. But in other parts, even in Lahore, where, you know, the Orange Line or big projects like that are being funded through CPEC, you know, they are, you know, again, on class lines, squatters, low-income settlements, small shopkeepers get displaced. And then, you know, Lahore is another good example. Lahore is small, in fact, I think in the last few weeks has been, along with Delhi, the world's most polluted city. And a lot, not all of it, but a lot of it is construction, CPEC-related construction, emissions more generally. So there are those underbellies as well, right? So there's this larger discourse of China, sort of organized social forces that play that out and sort of reinforce that feeling of China being. The saying is, China's friendships is higher than the mountains and deeper than the seas, which the less said about that, the better, frankly. But that then is tempered with sort of the fallouts that the Chinese developmental footprint generates. So, you know, I wouldn't say that the latter are significant enough to really displace the larger narrative about China, but they're significant. And I think that the more and more that, and then actually and then there's another story about the unevenness of development that is historically played out in Pakistan, especially regionally, and ethnic nationalist conflicts to which some of China's interventions perhaps are not giving rise, but reinforcing, consolidating. So yeah, so there's many sub-themes here, but yeah, that just, well, I hope that answers some of your question.
Sadia, if you have anything to add, if not, I will sort of ask that there have been some questions in the chat, and one of them is about, can you talk about where India fits in? You know, I remember, Sadia, you mentioned the story about sort of, you know, stories about sabotage and so on, but I think this person wants to know, what do they think about the China-Pakistan relationship in India? And then sort of a related question from somebody else who says, do you see an encouragement in proliferation trend in South Asia when and if China becomes a world leader, either economically or otherwise? I mean, I'll sort of interpret that as, you know, what does it mean for nuclear proliferation? So.
As far as India's position on CPEC is concerned, that has been very clear and categorical. India has, from the day one, opposed the China-Pakistan economic corridor. The position that India has taken is that it infringes India's sovereignty, and that's it's sad because some of the projects under the CPEC would sort of require the territory that's claimed as disputed. So it's part of the Gilgit-Baltistan region, and we are seeing a lot of developments in that particular region, political developments in that particular region, which are fueling India's concerns even further. So India's position has been that if there is any construction or any mega project developed in Gilgit-Baltistan area, which is part of the larger Kashmir dispute, then that would mean change of status quo. China had been pretty cautious over the past few years not to challenge the status quo in Gilgit-Baltistan region. So no mega projects have been developed, but recently we have started seeing some kind of conversation on, or resumption of conversation on projects like the Amir Bhasha Dam. And that has a lot to do with the broader regional politics, which involves the change of status quo on Kashmir from the Indian side when the Indian government revoked the Article 370 on Kashmir. So it's part of that entire sort of milieu. As far as proliferation trends are concerned, I would say I don't really see China encouraging nuclear proliferation. I think China has been, as far as nuclear weapons are concerned, I think China has been fairly responsible, if I may use that word, at least in terms of developing its own weapons. I think China has maintained the minimum credible deterrence in a real sense, and in that sense, I don't really see that kind of a danger because of China.
Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, look, I think the India factor, of course, you know, you can't eliminate, or it would be, of course, entirely impossible to really talk through any of this without thinking about India. I mean, from the Pakistani side, you know, anyone who's familiar with the region knows that this is a long, drawn-out, very painful story, at least for the people of the region, as far as I'm concerned. And it's never-ending. And I think that, you know, it is. That's why I started initially with this very complex Cold War dynamics, right? Because even in the context of the Cold War, I mean, there's communist Soviet Union and communist China, but communist China and India, as we know, since the border dispute of the late 50s, early 60s, were always on the opposing sides, and so that then triggers a relationship with doesn't trigger it, but sort of gives a fillip to a relationship with Pakistan that China cultivates. And that is continuing to play out. You know, it's been 60 years. So if China does something with Pakistan, inevitably India will view it as a challenge. Just like, you know, if we sort of zoom out further to a global level, China and the US, and it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't, I'm not saying like in general terms. I think every once in a while there have been feelers that no, you know, there could be space. China, I think, has said numerous times, no, there's space for anybody in this project. This is a regional project. This is not just about Pakistan. This is about the region at large. But you know, the kinds of strategic rivalries that China and India have had, and you know, and China and India and Pakistan have had, make for it a very complex situation. And Sadia also mentioned, of course, Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. So yeah, I mean, I can't see that any of these tensions just suddenly giving way to some, you know, land of milk and honey where everybody in the region comes together, sadly, because insofar as regional cooperation is something that could benefit everyone, I mean, that's what would need to happen, but that's not about to happen. And I'm not sure that, of course, there's anything, and of course, these things can never really be verified anyway. Is India actively colluding with let's say militants to sabotage? I mean, these sorts of accusations go back and forth between India and Pakistan regularly. In recent days, there's been another set of dossiers that this time, I mean, historically, India provides information against Pakistan's sort of so-called meddling in India, and now it's the other way. So I don't see that changing. And I see China, of course, the more China's footprint grows, the more these sorts of, whether it's rhetorical or whether there will be real sort of, you know, actual tangible conflicts that are generated. Hopefully not, but you cannot rule that out, certainly.
Another question that's come up is, I guess it relates also to the point made about the growth in sort of religious forces within Pakistan in the public domain. And the question being asked is, what does Pakistan think of the treatment of Chinese Muslims, the Uighurs, by the Chinese government? And what's the kind of view there?
Yeah, I mean, this is a sort of a, I mean, it's almost a bad joke, really. Something came up, I think, in quite recently, where the Pakistani Prime Minister was asked about this. He's like, "Oh, I don't know about this." I mean, it was a bad joke, right? So it was one of those things like where it was quite obvious that he was just, you know, zipping his lips because it's China and China, and I'm not going to speak ill of China no matter what, even though the rest of the world may be. Yeah, I will say I do share Sadia's sort of like, you know, that sentiment that she expressed. You know, the way, of course, the issue of Xinjiang and the Uighurs is in its own right, it demands attention. But of course, there's this whole sub-theme of how the US in particular is sort of, you know, playing the holier than thou role. And that always, you know, sadly, it's peoples and regions like this are basically strategic sort of, one would call sort of like how to embarrass big powers trying to embarrass one another without really anyone being genuinely interested in the welfare of the peoples themselves. So I mean, Pakistan is a classic example of that, right? Like our country is prides itself, at least in the public domain, at least at the state level, as being always at the forefront. Of course, Kashmir is the best example, but anyone else. Interestingly, you might be interested to know that in just the last few days, with the UAE having normalized ties with Israel and talk of Saudi Arabia sort of also wanting to do, or at least informally perhaps already has done, but so now there's this talk, oh well, Pakistan should also consider this. So I mean, it's not just the Uyghurs, there's also, like, of course, the Palestinian cause, which is historically viewed as being one of the most significant, so to speak, Muslim causes, which of course it isn't, because there's a significant number of Palestinians who are Christians, but that's not how these public perception projects work. So it's the same thing with China and Xinjiang. I mean, no, it's not talked about. It can't be talked about. You can't really bring it up. Mum is the word, really, and I don't see that changing so long as China's interests are viewed as being, or at least not entirely synonymous with, but very congruent with Pakistan's interests.
Sadia, did you want to add anything, or shall I move? Okay. All right. So there's somebody who says, I have 4 points to Dr. Aasim. One is US military alliance versus Chinese military alliance, Pakistan's economic relations with China and implications for India, Pakistan's current foreign policy and its economy, current scenario of Pakistan's security as government officials handing over documents to China regarding India's involvement in destabilizing CPEC. Now, there's no question really there, but if any of those points sort of strike a chord, you want to sort of elaborate on any of them, please.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I think we've been talking about all of these things already, so I wouldn't say that there's much more for me to add. I mean, we haven't talked about China's historic role in terms of military support, to be fair, so perhaps one can do that. I mean, there's that, yes, certainly. China was, and Sadia is probably much better equipped to talk about this at length than I am, but was one of sort of the major supporters when Pakistan's nuclear program got off, was initiated in the 70s. And there have been, for military, support, aid, training that China has historically provided. I don't think that there's anything in the magnitude that American sort of military assistance has been. And I think perhaps more importantly, generally the demeanor, the larger sort of, let's say, worldview of the Pakistani military has largely been shaped by its encounter with the Pentagon and the West more generally, rather than China. But it's a factor, certainly, and China does do some hardware support, I believe. So it's there. I'm not sure there's much of a versus there. I don't think, if you're asking whether there's perhaps, which one is better, I mean, for me, neither is better, to be honest, but, that's just me. I'm not the best person to ask on that sort of thing, and otherwise, yeah, I think that the last part I'll go over again. Look, I can't say that people like ourselves, we're not privy to these sorts of things. Do we have information? Can we verify? Like, these are things that states say about one another, and I think, at least as academics, if nothing else, that we are. I think our sort of almost task is to be critical of all such rhetorical statements, whichever way they come from. As I say, I don't think there's any doubt that, and Sadia made this clear, even official policy to an extent from Delhi is that they do say, look, we have serious reservations about CPEC, whether it's the geographical sort of question of where CPEC installations can or should be allowed to be built with regards to disputed international territory, so on and so forth, or otherwise more generally about, whether it represents some new form of encirclement or what have you. And vice versa, right? That's the same thing when India talks about, nuclear treaties with with America or does deals with Israel or what have you, there'll be similar statements from Pakistan. Or whether, whether stuff is happening in Kashmir, militancy, which India accuses Pakistan of sponsoring, or something happening in Balochistan, let's say, which Pakistan accuses India of sponsoring. This is old news. This will happen. This will continue to happen. And for me, it's not something that it's usually tit for tat in a sense. And I can't say that I or anyone like myself, I think generally is just not privy or equipped to be able to say, oh, is this accurate or is this not accurate? I think more important is, yes, they both have strategic rivalries, and this is part of the rhetoric of how these rivalries play out.
Great. No, I totally agree. And I think I like the way you sort of distinguished us from the states, us as either as academics or just as, citizens. We don't control what these states do, and this is how states act anyway, and they probably do some of these things. So that's great. There's been a couple of other questions sort of along these lines, and I'm going to just sort of bundle them up. One is, this is more like a rhetorical question, but I'm going to state it anyway. The Indian media has accused Pakistan of sponsoring terrorism. The Pakistani media has accused India of destabilizing Balochistan. When will India and Pakistan have a neutral media and a free press? Do you think this will ever change? I mean, I guess, the answer is fairly obvious.
I wonder if, can I say, when will any country in the world have a neutral media and a free press? I mean, India and Pakistan may be out there on the spectrum. And I fully agree with you. I have no hesitation in saying that we have extremely bellicose and nationalistic medias. But this is the corporate media everywhere, right? Like, what sort of meaningful debates about issues that affect people, as opposed to kinds of filtered, selected facts that media's across the world. But when will they? I don't know. I mean, our job is to keep pushing the agenda and keep asking the difficult and critical questions, and often at risk. I mean, it's not an easy job to be in countries like India and Pakistan. As you can see these days, there's a lot of, whether it's media persons or academics are facing a great deal of repression just for asking questions, let alone doing any disclosure. So I can't say it's around the corner that everything will be free and open and fair and not selective. But, thankfully, there's still people out there fighting the good fight.
Great. And this is something, as you rightly point out, this is not at all specific to India and Pakistan. As Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman sort of pointed out a long while ago, some of these tropes are excellent ways of sort of controlling the media. So there was another question which sort of has a very similar tone, which is from thanking you for a very insightful talk, and request if you could speak to the recent speculation and news regarding the warming of relations between China and Iran, especially in terms of Chabahar port. Will Pakistan be able to leverage the growing relations to further its interests in South Asia, or will the Iran-China relation remain largely bilateral?
Yeah, Chabahar has been a sort of on-off sort of story. It's not, as far as I know, and I can't say that I've followed it all that closely in recent times, it's still very much in a phase of discussion and sort of potential, rather than something that's very well developed. Iran is just generally speaking, Iran is a bit of an unknown, in the sense of, like, Iran and Pakistan, again, in recent decades have not had the closest, warmest relationship, let's say, and this of course relates a lot to Afghanistan in particular as well, right? Iran has, for the most part, at least over the last 20 years, generally tended to be well, definitely not pro-Taliban, let's say, and been more supportive of what was once called the Northern Alliance groups, but generally the non-Pashtun sort of elements in Afghanistan. So these tensions are there between Iran and Pakistan. There was, of course, one very promising sort of distinct possibility some years ago was these gas pipelines that were once floated as coming through Iran, from Iran through India and Pakistan. Of course, India and Pakistan have great substantial energy demand and needs, and if Iran had been willing and able, which I think it was, and the ADB, strangely, was one of the major potential funders of that project, but it never really got off the ground. I think, if I'm not wrong, it was Turkmenistan was also involved as being sort of one of the gateways for those gas pipelines, or those proposed gas pipelines. And that is precisely the kind of breakthrough kind of sort of projects that perhaps could shake up the regional balance. And maybe, you know, it could happen vis-a-vis Iran and China, but, you know, again, it's also possible that, you know, once China gets into the mix, and suddenly India will have a different take on all of those things. In any case, those pipelines never ended up being taken forward. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether, you know, an Iran-China sort of discussion, which of course Iran and China do have their own ties, which date, you know, predate CPEC or any of these more recent sort of proposals. So whether something like that would be good for Pakistan, it could well be, but really for me, the question is whether it would be good for the region. And I think that if India and Pakistan continue to be, or India and China continue to be sort of non-starters, if those relationships continue to be sort of zero-sum in the way that they've tended to be, or they've largely been for the best part of the last 70 years, then, you know, all of these projects will always have you know, there'll be a big but, because then they won't have the kinds of larger peace dividend, the larger peace dividends won't accrue to the peoples of the regions that perhaps I think people like ourselves are keen to see happening.
And thank both of you profusely for sort of joining us and talking in this very interesting way about a topic that we hear about often from a very different perspective, and almost always from a very different perspective. So I want to thank you very much for sharing your perspectives to this, and to thank all of you for joining us this evening, and have a nice evening, or a nice day in your case, Sadia and Aasim.